Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition, a special edition of the Daily Friends Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Advocate Paul Hoffman to discuss a piece of draft legislation before our Parliament. It's not often that I think there's a lot of focus on specific pieces of legislation in Parliament that have been proposed by individual members. There's a private members bill, I think, put forward by Glenys Breitenbach from the DA. So we talked a little bit, very briefly on the show in our short version of the Daily Friend wrap about this Mien Makone last week. And Paul, you thought perhaps that we hadn't fully explored the issue or hadn't given it entirely a fair shake. So firstly, let me start off by introducing you of Paul Hoffman, who's a director for Accountability Now, Advocate Paul Hoffman. Paul, do you just want to talk a little bit about yourself and then how you got involved in this particular piece of legislation, advocating for it in Parliament?
Yes, I was a member of the Cape Bar for 26 years, and I worked out that that's a year more than a life sentence. So I quit, and I've been in the NGO sector ever since, working on human rights and largely on anti-corruption work. One of the first jobs we did as Accountability Now was the Glenister litigation, in which a Johannesburg businessman, Bob Glenister, took on the state for closing down the Scorpions, which until 2009 were our anti-corruption machinery of state and were treading on the toes of too many well-connected politicians. I think of the Travelgate fraudsters who all had a say in whether the Scorpions should be retained or not. And there were more than 100 of them. And think of Jackie Salebi, who was the chief of police and went down for corruption. And even Jacob Zuma, who was charged at that time. And it's in fact the charging of Jacob Zuma that led to the resolution at Polokwane in 2007, in which the ANC decided to instruct cabinet to urgently close down the Scorpions and transfer the investigative work that was being done on corruption by the Scorpions to the police, because the police are more malleable and much easier to control than.
And we're still waiting for Jacob Zuma's day in court.
Yes, and it's not going to come for some time yet, as far as I can see. So there you go. That's what that was held up until my birthday in October 2017, which is a very long time after Polokwane. It's 10 years after Polokwane, and then, and only then, did the Supreme Court of Appeal decide that Zuma could be charged. So the thing has a long history, but what we are here to talk about is what happened in the Glenister litigation. He was on appeal in the Constitutional Court on 3 separate occasions, and in his second case, on St. Patrick's Day in 2011. He was the winner of a joint judgment of Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke and Justice Edwin Cameron, which said in terms that our anti-corruption entity in South Africa should be outside executive control. And if one studies the judgment closely, as one can do by Googling the words under the swinging arch, where the judgment is actually set out in full as an appendix to the book Under the Swinging Arch, you will see that besides regarding independence of the corruption busters as vital, the court also said that it ought to be a single specialized body of trained personnel who enjoy secure tenure of office and who are properly resourced in guaranteed fashion. No standing on the oxygen tube, as it were. And that
right. Okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. So what does it really mean in practical terms for something to be separated from the executive? So that means that it would be an entirely independent unit that is not part of the Department of Justice, correct?
Yes, and that is what the NPA suffers from. So you're right, getting yourself away from executive control in the South African constitutional setup, in essence, means making yourself into a Chapter 9 institution. if you want to have all of the criteria that I've mentioned, in particular, secure tenure of office, then the Chapter 9 institutions, that's the Auditor General, the Public Protector, the IEC, Independent Electoral Commission, and of course the Human Rights Commission, among others, those all do not report to the executive branch of government. They report to Parliament, and they have constitutionally guaranteed independence. And that being the case, we looked at making them part of the Public Protector's Office, which is a possibility, even attaching them to the Auditor General as a follow-up. The Auditor General finds 38 billion of irregular expenditure a year, then you know that he's got a lot that requires criminal investigation. So those were considered, but we came to the conclusion at Accountability Now that a separate entity, because of the requirement of the court that a specialist body dedicated to dealing with serious corruption is actually what the law and the Constitution require. And the NPA is certainly not that body. I don't think I need to persuade anybody that the NPA is a broken institution. In fact, Justice Richard Goldstone, who's one of our trustees, calls it gutted. And that is a fair description of what has happened, because the NPA was a victim of state capture in spades and still houses plenty of saboteurs who are there in the NPA to see to it that the recipients of the largesse of grand corruption enjoy complete impunity, never see the inside of a court, let alone the inside of an orange overall. So that persuaded us to go down that route.
So basically, this thing would actually be very protected because it's not just a simple majority in Parliament that would be able to get rid of this institution. It would be a 2/3 majority, right, if it's going along with those other institutions.
And practically impossible.
Yes.
You're not going to find anybody commanding a 2/3 majority in the foreseeable future in the South African Parliament.
No, I think that's very true.
Only 40%, yeah.
We were, and we'll get back to that in a second. Can you just go into a little bit more about what the gutting of the NPA has looked like? You've mentioned the, sort of politically active cronies and cadres and such being placed inside the thing to protect politically connected individuals, but I know there's also been issues raised around capacity as well. Could you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, I think that the government has kept them on a very tight rein when it comes to budget. Jacob Zuma tried to appoint Mendacious Menzi Simelane as his first leader of the National Prosecuting Authority, and that was set aside by the Constitutional Court as an irrational exercise of power, because you cannot have a man who lies on oath as your National Director of Public Prosecutions. He was succeeded by an attorney from KwaZulu-Natal called Ntasana, and he was bribed by Jacob Zuma to give up his job because he had indicated that should the DA win their review proceedings for the prosecution of Zuma to be reinstated, he would prosecute without fear, favor, or prejudice. And Zuma took exception to that. And we had Sean Abrams, various people who have been kicked out of office at high level in the National Prosecuting Authority. And because of the tight rein, they've been unable to recruit enough people, unable to train people appropriately in anti-corruption work, and in fact in any work. And so we have a system that is creaking at the moment because the anti-corruption machinery of state just is as broken as the NPA. They tried to fix it with an ID, investigating directorate within the NPA, by way of proclamation, which just doesn't even get off the ground as an independent body. And then just before the election, IDAC, the investigating directorate against corruption, the big brother of the ID, was appointed as a stopgap measure, interim step on the way to proper compliance with the Glenister rules, the STIRS criteria of the Glenister rules: specialized, trained, independent, resourced, and secure. Those are what you expect of your anti-corruption machinery if it is going to be effective and efficient, which is what Section 195 of the Constitution requires. So the current system is very much like the Scorpions were in 2007, before the Polokwane resolution. And like the Scorpions, IDAC could be closed down by a simple majority, which is your point. That would not happen with a Chapter 9 anti-corruption body, which is why the DA, after a lot of arm twisting and persuasion, accepted in 2022 the suggestion that we made in 2021 after the ANC's own National Executive Committee. I thought I could retire and live happily ever after in August 2020, which is when the ANC NEC resolved to instruct Cabinet to set up a permanent, standalone, independent anti-corruption body that would be able to act without fear, favor, or prejudice. That is a resolution that was solemnly passed by the NEC of the ANC in August 2020. I believe that the eureka moment of the ANC had been reached, and that we would shortly see legislation that would give us something along the lines of what Glenys Breitenbach proposed last Tuesday, on what was it, the 26th of November, to be the anti-corruption body in South Africa. Of course, nothing was done after the 2020 resolution, other than IDAC, which only came this year. And so, unable to walk my dogs and tend my garden, I got on with the task of suggesting the type of legislation that the ANC's NEC had resolved should be brought onto the statute book. And those suggestions are in that book, Under the Swinging Arch, and they have been used as the basis for the two bills that Glenys Breitenbach, as Shadow Minister of Justice when she started, and now as a member of the GNU, so-called, and as a member of the Portfolio Committee on Justice. She has piloted these bills as private members' bills, but is quite happy to let them become a committee bill if the bills commend themselves to the committee. And we wait with bated breath to see what the ANC is going to do. Will it hang in with the 2020 resolution, or will it pursue some other direction, which would probably not be the best practice response to the judgment of the joint judgment of the justices back in 2011. There's been no political will to do the right thing. That's really the problem.
Yeah, I understand completely your hope to have retired when the ANC NEC passed that resolution. But unfortunately, I think that just as there are no truly lost causes, there are also probably no truly won causes either. These things require constant plugging away. So basically, the idea of this Chapter 9 institution is that it's independently, it's got its own budget, it's got a proper budget, it's not allowed to just be as you said, the oxygen stepped on. So it can't be controlled, it can't be bullied by Parliament, it can't just be gotten rid of, and it will target specifically high-level corruption with specialists and that sort of thing. What does it mean? What does high-level corruption mean? I believe that there was a proviso in this that the Parliament will define what high-level corruption is.
Yes. When we made our suggestion, we said anything above 5 million should be regarded as serious. But it's up to Parliament to decide exactly how they will define the work that falls within the mandate of this body. There's a suggestion from the DA that it should cover organized crime as well. Very often there's overlap, and the idea of the bill is that where there's overlap, the anti-corruption body will be seized with the work at hand to prevent, combat, investigate, prosecute serious corruption as decided upon by Parliament. So the framework of the Act will set out what the level is where the specialized anti-corruption body is activated. Anything that falls below that will be dealt with like it's dealt with now by the Hawks, who do the investigation as a police unit, and by the NPA, who prosecute as they do in the courts all day, every day.
Okay, so let's get into some questions I do have about it. So if I may be a bit theoretical, I'm a pretty big fan of a lot of our Constitution. However, I have not always been the greatest fan of the idea of the sort of Chapter 9 institutions. I think about, so the Chapter 9 institutions are the Public Protector, South African Human Rights Commission, the Commission to Promote the Rights of Cultural, Religious, Linguistic Communities, the Commission for Gender Equality, the Auditor General, the Independent Electoral Commission, and the Independent Authority to Regulate Broadcasting. I find that because I studied politics in university, in my sort of theoretical model, these sort of seem a little bit kind of off to the side, and it's not always clear what sort of role they can kind of play. So I think obviously that's not an issue so much with the thing you're proposing here, because it's got a very specific objective. But I do worry that them sort of being kind of outside the normal political bodies, that being the executive and the legislature, means that they can kind of become tools of various factions. So I like to think, for example, in the Public Protector, I think is the best case of this. You had Tuli Malansela, who held the executive to account on the Nkandla report. She put out this thing saying that Jacob Zuma had benefited from it. And upon realizing that the Public Protector could be such an effective weapon in the hands of if it had someone at the helm who was willing to take on and show independence, immediately a deployee was entered in there to capture the institution in the interests of sort of the Zuma faction of the ANC. And we saw Busisizwe Mkhwebane taking over that position. So if you had a powerful, politically important position like something that was targeting high-level corruption, isn't the fear that suddenly the game in politics would be to just focus all attention on capturing that institution and making sure that it can't be used to disrupt whoever's the most important people in power? Presumably Parliament would have to have some involvement in the appointment of what goes on here. What's your response to that criticism?
Yes, I think that... sorry about that. There's a fire in the galley. Good. He's decided to go to the galley and put it out. To deal specifically with the appointment problem that you raise, what we see as the answer to that is that everybody who gets a job in the Anti-Corruption Commission must be thoroughly vetted and integrity tested and subjected to a selection process that is as objective as you can be in politics. Because if you do it that way, you're not going to have a bunch of deployed cadres doing the dominant faction's will, which is what happened when Busi and Mkhwebane became the Public Protector. And so stepping back from that specific answer, which is be careful about how you appoint people, the big picture answer to the difficulties that you have with an idea of a Chapter 9 in the Constitution at all is that all of these institutions have been created to support constitutional democracy. It says so in the heading. And to my way of thinking, that was a wise move in 30 years ago when the Constitution was being negotiated through the processes of the National Accord and CODESA and so on. South Africans have always been in a dominant party state. They've tended to be passive subjects rather than active citizens. And the idea of properly executed, the idea of having Chapter 9 institutions would have been to popularize the ideas of the Constitution in public imagination. And if you could get that right through having a Human Rights Commission that was more interested in rolling out human rights than in protecting the politically powerful or even their political friends, as has happened with that report on the insurrection in KZN back in July 21, where the interference from the top within the Human Rights Commission suggests, according to the allegations made by those working on the report, that a result that fingers Jacob Zuma and his pals was just not acceptable to the leadership of the Human Rights Commission. And of course, the whole Busisiwe and Kubani debacle was a fine illustration of the capture of what should be a constitutionally independent body to serve the agenda of the Zuma faction. But stepping back one step further back, if I may, there are academics who call Chapter 9 institutions the integrity and accountability branch of government. Traditionally, you've had a legislature, an executive, and a judiciary, and that has been allowed to work its way through the system. And many countries manage without Chapter 9 institutions. But a fourth leg on the pot of government called the Chapter 9 or the integrity and accountability institutions seems to me to be a valuable addition to what we had before. And I think it was important for us back in the 90s to put distance between the parliamentary sovereignty of the old South Africa and the constitutional democracy under the rule of law of the new South Africa. And one of the ways of doing that, if we had properly functioning Chapter 9 institutions, would be to make human rights real, to make elections free and fair, to ensure that public money is spent properly by the audits of the Auditor General, and so on with the gender and other commissions. You'll recall that Professor Kader Asmal ran a commission of inquiry, informally, parliamentary commission, on the future of the Chapter 9 institutions and made recommendations to consolidate some of the smaller Chapter 9s under the Human Rights Commission. And that could still be done today, especially if it's felt that we're overcrowding the field by creating an anti-corruption commission as well. So that is something that could be usefully done. And if in all of the Chapter 9 institutions, proper appointment procedures are put in place, I think you will find that it is actually a lot easier to have a government that functions in an open, accountable, and responsive way, rather than have state capture and rampant corruption, which is what we have endured for the last 30 years in what continued to be a dominant party state, building on the 1948 to 1994 efforts of the National Party, the ANC continued in that way until May this year.
No, I'm very much of the belief that it's very difficult to run a constitutional system when you have, one change of government between 1948 and basically now, I guess. So what is those you mentioned sort of integrity tests and very strict scrutiny of people who get appointed to this sort of thing. What does that look like in practice? What sort of what does that test actually look like? As in, how can we make it as objective as you'd hope it to be?
Yes, I think that integrity testing involves a lie detector in which the applicant for a job is actually put through a lie detector test to see whether there are any skeletons rattling around in the background. And then, especially with senior appointments, I think you need to make sure that the authority of the body or person that is effecting the appointments is as Caesar's wives would have been. So what Willie Hofmeyer suggested some years ago was that we should have in South Africa a commission for senior appointments and disappointments. That would be rather like the Judicial Services Commission, but with no politicians in it and appropriate personnel considering who should be in Chapter 9 institutions, in the public service, in state-owned enterprises, and of course, gracing the bench in the judiciary. And if you made that into a body that functions with integrity and probity, then you would be cooking with gas, and constitutional democracy would be delivered, and we would live in a country where peace is secure, prosperity is shared, and progress is sustainable. And isn't that really what we set out to do in 1994?
Indeed. That has been the hope for South Africa, I think, for many years now. So we've dealt now with talking about this institution to prevent it being captured by, let's say, the political elite. But let's imagine a scenario where you have a sort of disconnected legal elite, not people who are corrupt, but people who are perhaps ideological and zealous. I mean, essentially, this is the sort of criticism almost made of this thing by I guess some of them. I'm modifying the MK parliamentarian sort of criticism of this thing, but basically they were kind of saying, what if this thing goes rogue? Let's say it's got it's staffed with people, particularly its leader, who has their sort of own ideas of what constitutes justice and law, and they just start using their power to the maximum, abusing it wherever they can, and trying to pursue a sort of overzealous approach towards prosecuting in government. Is there any risk of that, and that this thing would not be able to be placed sort of under any kind of democratic control?
You'll remember that Justice Cameron was a co-author of the majority judgment, which gave us the STIRS criteria of Glenister 2. In Glenister 3, he was one of the minority in that case, which was heard or finalized in 2014. And he wrote a minority judgment in Glenister 3, in which he turned his attention to the very questions that you are asking now. And the answer has to be that you must make your appointment procedure as foolproof as you can, so that you do not appoint bad eggs into key positions in your anti-corruption, or in fact in any institution where integrity is part of the name of the game. So you secure accountability and integrity by a reporting line to Parliament, which is far different to a reporting line to the executive, and by the appointment of personnel who you think you can trust. And I don't say it's foolproof, but I do say that it will give us a system that works considerably better than what we've had to endure for the last 30 years. No leader of the National Prosecuting Authority has seen out his or her term of office so far. It looks as though the current incumbent, Shamila Batoy, might make it to January 26 when she will get to the end of her term. But I wouldn't put too much money on that either.
Yeah, no, a year is a very long time in South African politics. So yeah, I agree. Very many things could happen between now and then. Okay, so I guess that's some of the sort of theoretical concerns about this. Maybe let's talk about some sort of practical ones. The first one is a sort of political problem, which is you're asking firstly the same parliament that has been sort of either covering up for or ignoring a lot of corruption for a long time to empower a body that would essentially be able to investigate itself. And so therefore, especially if you need 2/3 of parliamentarians to agree to this, is there any hope politically? So, the DA seems to be on board, but now you need at least the ANC and maybe, I can't remember the exact math, but maybe another one or two bits and bobs. Is there any chance, do you think the ANC is going to come on board with this project?
Yes, I think that it is possible that the ANC will come on board with the project, not only because of the resolution of its NEC, which is really the top 80 or 90 people in the ANC. It shows that resolution, unless it was just a complete foofy, and it shows an intention to be serious about corruption. And I think that those who are in Parliament will, as we sit here discussing this matter, will be putting pressure on Cabinet to go along with the Breitenbach bills for the very simple reason that to be seen to be opposing them will be construed by the man in the street and the voter in the street as being soft on corruption. And if you are seen as soft on corruption, you lose votes. Ask the ANC, they will explain exactly how that happened to them. So many in the ANC caucus, especially the ones at the bottom of the letterhead, the ones who just made it into Parliament on the list, will be keen to go back to Parliament after 29 or after the next general election. And they will see their opportunity or their chances of re-election enhanced by the passage of the Anti-Corruption Commission legislation. Whereas if the ANC kiboshes the whole idea by simply saying, sorry, we're not interested in this, then the voters will punish them accordingly when they get the opportunity, both in the local government elections and in the next national general election, which is 29, I think. Yeah, so that I think is the difficulty is that so many people who are high up in cabinet, for example, in the ANC, are people who have skeletons in there. I think Batabili Dlamini called them small Anyana skeletons in their cupboards. And those skeletons is what made the cabinet drag its feet all the way from August 2020 when the instruction came from the NEC, because the NEC is actually the highest decision-making body in the ANC between conferences. So they were between conferences, the resolution was passed, and the way that it was responded to was to give us IDAC. And IDAC does not comply with any of the criteria that were laid down in binding terms in the second Glenister case in 2011. So that being the case, there will be resistance among those with small Anyana skeletons in their cupboards, and whether they will have sufficient say and sufficient numbers in the ANC decision-making processes is an interesting question, but it's one that I'm not a political scientist like you. I'm just a a common or garden lawyer, which means that anything I say about, anything I say about politics is probably dangerous. But
I think you may have gotten it wrong there. I think I'm the common garden character, and you're the the venerable lawyer. But let's not get too bogged down in that one. Yeah, I mean, I think this is, on a sort of political standpoint, an important opportunity for the ANC to be able to show that actually it's interested in doing something different from what it's done for the last, since 2008, basically, of covering up this kind of stuff and going in the wrong direction. I think, there's a lot of talk of renewal inside the ANC, and this is an opportunity to show that actually they are sort of serious about it. It's not just shuffling chairs on a sinking ship. Another criticism, perhaps, of this piece of legislation is that it's trying to fix the whole problem all at once in a very difficult way, whereas rather you could make smaller reforms that might be more effective. So, for example, you invited me to a discussion just before this, where one of the things brought up was, for example, taking away the power to control salaries from the minister, or making that HR decisions within the National Prosecuting Authority more independent. Do you think that there's sort of space for those, or do we need to, or is only a very serious reform like this going to have any real hope of kind of curbing the problem of corruption?
Yes, well, I had the rare and valuable opportunity of putting my tuppence worth in when the Portfolio Committee received the bill on Tuesday last. And what I said then, I will say again now, because I think it's important that a lot of people do understand where I'm coming from with this. The Anti-Corruption Commission is not a nice to have. It's not an option. It is the only way that we have been able to devise to properly implement a binding decision of the highest court in the land. You cannot, if you are a respecter of the rule of law, you cannot, if you wish to implement the Bill of Rights, you cannot, if you want to honor your international treaty obligations to keep independent anti-corruption machinery of state, if you cannot possibly get those three things right if you continue with incremental tinkering here and there and changing part of the executive control of the NPA. The NPA is run as a program within the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice answers to the Minister of Justice. It is of the executive branch of government. The accounting officer of the NPA is the Director General of Justice. You don't get paper clips and printing paper without his say-so. And that's the least of their problems, because they are so short of staff and short of expertise. And they admit it. It's not the NPA's fault that it doesn't work. It's the government's fault that it doesn't work, because the government has paid absolutely no attention to the requirements of the Glenister case, in spite of the fact that government is bound by what happened in the outcome of the Glenister case. And it's not only the executive that I'm pointing a finger at. The legislature is required, in terms of the Constitution, to ensure that legislation that it passes is properly implemented. Now, the legislation that was passed after Glenister 2 was meant to bring about effective and efficient anti-corruption activity in South Africa. Well, there hasn't been any, not at all, not since 2008 and not since 2014, when the final version of the Hawks became what we have had ever since. The Hawks do very good work in lots of aspects of the priority crimes that they are required to investigate, but they do not get off the ground in relation to corruption in high places, because they answer to the Minister of Police in the same way as the National Prosecuting Authority answers to the Minister of Justice. It gets worse. The Constitution itself says that the minister has final responsibility over the National Prosecuting Authority, and the minister must concur in all prosecution policy that is devised by the leadership of the NPA. Now, those factors just tell you that the NPA is not, as it is currently constituted, is not the place to locate your anti-corruption machinery, and turning it into that sort of place while it still has a general mandate to prosecute all crime defies the specialist requirement. Dedicated specialists are required to deal with corruption. Corruption is a very difficult crime because it is done in secret, it is done deliberately, and it does not appear to have any direct victim who can say, excuse me, there's a body in my garden, somebody's been murdered here. That isn't what happens with corruption. Corruption is done insidiously, and certainly in the public sector, it is the poor who suffer across the board because money that was meant to be used to improve their lot of life ends up in the hands of corrupt operators and in the bank accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands and Dubai and Hong Kong, simply because it can be done and you can get away with it. You only deter corruption, not by being nice people and by pushing honesty in the public space, but by deterring those who are prepared to engage in corruption by locking them up for a long time. And when that starts happening, they will move on to some other jurisdiction where it's easier to be corrupt, rather than try their corrupt activities within South Africa. And that will be to the overall benefit of the people of South Africa and to constitutional democracy and the realization of the promises of the Constitution, especially as regards all those expensive socioeconomic human rights like healthcare and education.
Yes. So you explained why you think we can't go small, but is it not also could we not go, say, even bigger and say, no, this isn't enough? Because the real problem in South Africa is that we actually have a political problem in that our voters are not holding to account our politicians more aggressively enough in order to make sure that they perform and that they're not corrupt, and that rather the place we should be putting our efforts is into political and cultural changes to build a civil society movement that really encourages voters to go out there and punish politicians, citizens to go out there and punish politicians for being corrupt, and that ultimately this institution, like any institution, is vulnerable to corruption. What's your thoughts on that?
Yes, you're taking me back to the very first thing we did when we started Accountability Now in 2009. We, like you, see civic education turning those passive subjects of apartheid into active and participative citizens in the new South Africa. And what we did is we produced a handbook which has the pertinent title, Know Your Rights, Claim Your Rights. It's available for free on the Accountability Now website, and it is the user's manual for the man in the street. It is a summary of the Constitution, not written by lawyers, you'll be pleased to hear, but written in terms that a functionally literate youngster can understand and can use in order to get away from the idea of burning tires and the school library whenever you're unhappy with what's happening politically, and instead take a complaint to the Office of the Public Protector, go to the Human Rights Commission, go to the Gender Commission, and explain what your problem is, and have the state, as the Constitution intends, attend to your problem. So I'm entirely in agreement with you that too many people in South Africa choose not to participate in politics because they've either had it with politicians or they've never actually understood the power of their vote. The ANC got 40% of the votes cast in the last election, May this year, with 16% of the eligible voters supporting them. Now, the way that you harness those who are out of the loop is to get them to know their rights and to claim their rights. And I'm not only talking about the right to vote. I'm talking about the right to have your chapter 2 human rights respected, protected, promoted, and fulfilled by the state. If that starts to happen in South Africa, our politicians will become a little more honest than they are at the moment, and service delivery will not be the manana sort of problem that we have at the moment.
Right. Okay, so let's. I think I can't think of anything else off the top of my mind that would that I can critique this proposal on. So let me go a little bit sort of off of left field with your indulgence, and this is an argument that I've heard before, which I think it does have some merit, and I'd like your response on it because I know that you're very concerned with corruption activities. This is the idea of good enough governance. That when you look at countries like China, Indonesia, Vietnam, there's a bunch of other countries around the world that kind of fit this, India to some degree, you've got societies that are politically dysfunctional in very serious ways. China's a totalitarian state. So is Vietnam to some degree. India is very corrupt, very dysfunctional. Its politics doesn't work well. Its public services don't work well. And yet, for most people living in those countries, particularly over the past couple of decades, 20, 30 years, life has gotten better. There has been economic growth. This argument basically goes that as long as governance is good enough, that it's okay-ish, and that you don't have kind of policies and rent extraction that steps in the way too much, that corruption itself is not necessarily the problem. It's more the sort of form of corruption. And that, we're sort of kind of focusing on the wrong thing by focusing far too much on corruption as opposed to some of these other substantive issues with legislation, things like, in South African context, it could be employment equity. In other countries, it could be localization. That also applies to South Africa, I guess, localization laws, stuff like that. What's your case for why corruption is public enemy number one?
Yes, well, I think I'm on the side of former Chief Justice Zondo on that one, where he said a year ago now that unless drastic action is taken rapidly, we will not have a country that we can call home. He spent years on this, every day running his commission. He sees corruption as a cancer in South African society, not an ailment that is tolerable because there are so many zillions of people and so much money in South Africa, but because it's state capture. It's not just corruption. It's grand corruption on a grand scale. We talk in trillions when we talk about the loot of state capture in South Africa. And it isn't what we set out to do when we turned away from the parliamentary sovereignty of the apartheid regime and put in its place what is generally regarded around the world by people who matter as a model constitutional democracy under the rule of law that could serve as a template and has served as a template. When Egypt had the Egyptian Spring, they invited Ruth Bader Ginsburg, to the Supreme Court judge in America, to come and advise them on what they should do next. And she went there and said, don't look at the American Constitution. It's over 200 years old. Rather take your lead from the South African Constitution. And there are many countries in Africa the Kenyans have also adopted a constitution that is very comparable to ours. And we have, like, South African exceptionalism is a curse, but it's also a blessing in some ways. We somehow managed to avoid a catastrophe in this country by turning away from parliamentary sovereignty and putting in its place a supreme constitution in which politicians need to understand that they cannot do as they please in South Africa. They have to conduct themselves and to pass laws in a way that is consistent with the Constitution. If it's not consistent with the Constitution, it is invalid, unconstitutional, unlawful, and liable to be struck down, as has occurred on many occasions. That's what Glenister did. He struck down the law that created the Hawks because the Hawks were not sufficiently independent to fit the job description that the Constitutional Court fashioned for them on the basis of OECD research that was available to the court at the time, and which set the criteria for effective and efficient anti-corruption machinery. So, yes, there may well be countries that function with a great deal of corruption, but there's a great deal of poverty and a great deal of authoritarianism and a great lack of freedom in all of those countries. And if we value our freedom, then we have to be vigilant to see that the corrupt do not take it away from us via the back door by siphoning away the wealth of the nation and using it for their own nefarious purposes when it should be used for respecting, protecting, promoting, and fulfilling the human rights that we decided in our wisdom to guarantee to all when we made the Bill of Rights both justiciable and part of our supreme law.
There's a lot of things I admire about India, and I'm fascinated about that country because it's so sort of big and weird and chaotic and interesting. But I must say their right to free speech in their constitution leaves a lot to be desired. It says, everyone has the right to free speech, with the exception, and then it has this massive list of exceptions, which is open to so much abuse and has been used.
People go to jail for criticizing the president.
Yeah, exactly.
The prime minister.
So yeah, no, I that's a point well taken. Are there any other thoughts you'd like to bring up before we bring this to a close?
No, I think that at this stage we're at a very interesting juncture. I wrote I had published in Business Day this morning a letter comparing the work of the OECD on procurement problems in South Africa, in which they came to the conclusion that our anti-corruption machinery is not up to scratch, juxtapositioned in the same week as the introduction of the Breitenbach Bill to set up an anti-corruption commission under Chapter 9 in South Africa. I believe it can be done. I think that the criticisms lack weight. I know 5 different points were raised by MK, but you take those points from whence they come, and we know that MK would lose half of its leadership if there were any effective and efficient anti-corruption machinery doing its work in South Africa. So it's up to the voters to decide, and I think that the current situation is that it's up to the ANC to dust off its August 2020 resolution, compare that resolution with what Glynis Breitenbach is proposing, get into a debate, an honest debate about what would be best, and fashion a form of anti-corruption machinery that ticks the boxes created by the Glenister criteria. And South Africa can only benefit from it, and so can the politicians who vote in favor of it, because that can only enhance your electoral prospects at the next election. So I foresee a lot of debate within the ANC behind closed doors. And my prayer is that the ANC will come to the realization that if they are serious about renewal, they have to be serious about anti-corruption work. They have been led by people who stuff their couches, or in Zuma's case, stuff their country. And we can do better in South Africa, and the ANC itself can do better. So that I think is the message for those who command 40% of the votes in Parliament, because for the Breitenbach bills to succeed, they will require a 2/3 majority in Parliament, and the 1/3 is not really attainable unless the 1/3 against is not really attainable unless the ANC votes against.
Right.
I think it's 14.5% for MK and 9% for the EFF. So even if they are agreed that they would rather not have proper anti-corruption machinery, it won't help them if everybody else says, including the ANC, we think that the Breitenbach reform is something that needs to happen. It needs to be debated and refined, obviously. That's what Parliament is there for. Make sure that they come up with the best solution. But to simply reject it, I think, is a form of political suicide. And those who are being pressured to reject it know that that is the case.
I think you were being a little bit generous to MK by saying they would lose only half their leadership, but be that as it may. Thank you very much, Advocate Paul Hoffman, Director for Accountability Now. We really appreciate the time that you gave us today, and thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity, Nicholas. It's been an interesting discussion, and you certainly do know how to throw the curveball. The curveball only counts if the pitcher doesn't tell the batter that a curveball is coming.
Well, thank you very much. All right. Cheers, everyone.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed.